Hey, greetings and welcome to week 4, lecture 1. Throughout this week, we're going to be taking a little bit of a reflective journey into who we are, how we're wired, and specifically within the context of leadership, some of the saboteurs that might ultimately end up sidelining us or at least threatening the longevity we might have as leaders. We're going to be introduced, of course, in this week to the imposter through Abba's child, Brendan Manning. You're going to be writing a letter to your imposter. And I think we're going to spend a little bit of time in lecture 3 talking about the imposter and who that imposter might be. But in this lecture, I want to spend some time talking about what I'm going to call the 7 deadly sins of leadership. I'm sure there's more, and I'm sure these aren't the only ones, or I'm sure maybe that some of you could come up with a better list. But these are the ones that thematically I've come to discover kind of throughout scriptures consistently, whether they show up in Judges or 1st and 2nd Samuel or 1st and 2nd Kings, or all the way into the New Testament. These are emergent themes, and I want to pay attention to connecting points, right? So if I see things emerge over and over again through scriptures, I want to be able to put my finger on it and say there's something in that I think is probably still relevant to us today. And so we're going to look at those 7 deadly sins. And then in the second lecture, I'm going to spend some time talking about the specific handoff of power between King David and King Solomon, but specifically how the redactor of those stories begins to characterize that leadership or that handoff of power. So let's start by taking a look at the 7 deadly sins of leadership. Again, this is not exhaustive lists, and I'm certain that you might be able to think of better ones. But I want to start off with one that I don't think many of us will have trouble making sense of, and that's the word ego. I think pride, which I have recognized to be a blind spot for many of us leaders. We aren't always self-aware enough to understand how pride is at work in our lives, whether it's through our conversations, our interactions with others, even down to the way in which we conduct our leadership meetings or board meetings. It's funny, as I've become friends with multiple district superintendents who ultimately really want to be the pastor's friend, right? They want to be on the side of the pastor, and then the pastor will be having an issue with the church or with the board, and the DS will go there to support or to encourage the pastor in a board meeting. And then it'll become very evident very quickly in those board meetings the lack of self-awareness in the way in which the ego of the pastor has already shaped the environment of engagement, and the inability of the pastor to be able to hear the wise counsel, the good word, the challenges of the board, and who, because of their presumed position or their insecurities, fail to be able to recognize the contributions that the wise voices at the table might be able to offer to the vision of God. And so every criticism is a threat, and every naysayer, every no must be a call into question of my leadership or someone that I might have to watch out for. So ego shows up in a number of different ways, and I think it shows up one way is the desire to be someone. I think this is consistently affecting and impacting young leadership, specifically within the church. This idea to have a brand, to be the one who writes the next book, this desire to be counted as a voice or someone who gets to sit at the table, right? I hear that language all the time. I want to be able to have a seat at the table. Which is basically, I want to be recognized and valued for who I think I am. The second way in which I think pride shows up is thinking ourselves more highly than we ought. We have an incredible incapacity to recognize our own shortcomings. We're really, really good at pointing out the shortcomings in others, but we overestimate our own capacities. And so this becomes a saboteur because we're unable to recognize the points at which we must grow, and so we either try to be someone that we're not, or we think more highly of ourselves than we ought. Or I see ego show up in terms of a lack of vulnerability. I think that's a huge one as well. I'm going to wall myself off. I can't let people get too close. We talk about our isolation and our loneliness, but that is self-imposed often because I don't want to be able to let down my guard to let people see what's really behind the armor of my leadership. fearing that maybe they won't follow, and failing to recognize that people are most often compelled to follow leaders that they can trust who live out a faithful vulnerability. Or we define ourselves based upon some set of qualifications, whether it be our education, whether it be our past accomplishments. I see this a lot with ministers, especially those who are educated, where they might suggest that their education puts them above other leaders. And I think we've got to be careful not to allow ourselves to think of to anticipate or expect a certain level of respect, or deference based upon some presumed set of qualifications. And the last one is this overcompensation for insecurity in terms of how pride and ego works into our lives. And where I've seen this work out is people will say something like, I don't care what people think. And they really play into this hardened exterior or this brash character, when the truth is they probably do care what people think, but their ego isn't allowing them to admit that or acknowledge that or confess that. And so it continues to sabotage and blind them in their leadership. So that's the first one, ego. The second one, what I would say, would be impatience, which is really nothing more than an inability to wait upon God, the inability to trust that God's pace is the best pace. And a lot of times as leaders, we'll get a glimpse or a vision of what God is up to, and we'll run off after it, and not recognizing that we haven't continued to stay in step with the Spirit. It's almost like God gives us a glimpse, we take off, and then hope God baptizes our efforts later down the road. And I think that one becomes really difficult for us as leaders, because I think our people begin to recognize when we're trying to force something, we're trying to make something happen, and we're not being attentive to the movement of the Spirit, or to the pace of prayer. It's interesting. I'm left in the impatience category, thinking about the story of King Saul, who, in preparing to go to battle, felt like Samuel the prophet was delaying too long, and who takes it upon himself to offer a set of sacrifices that it was never his to offer. And Samuel shows up just as they're finishing, and Samuel is incensed by this, of course, because that was his role, it was his responsibility. And really, King Saul could offer no more justification other than it just took you too long. And I think too often that sense of God taking too long might motivate us to try to take things into our own hands and direct our own paths, or we get at something before we were adequately prepared for it. I think I see this happen with leaders. They take roles or responsibilities, make shifts that perhaps another couple years in the saddle, alongside of someone or learning from someone, would have helped them to avoid making certain decisions that might have ended up keeping them from making some of the significant mistakes that they've made throughout their years. Or impatience shows up in the failure to recognize seasons. We talked about seasons a little bit, and I do think there are seasons in our ministry, in our lives, and in our families. And impatience just pushes right through that. We're not going to acknowledge it. We're not going to pay attention to it. We're not going to recognize the rhythms of grace. We're just going to press on. And really, one of the ones that I think impatience affects is something that has probably gotten me more than I'd like to admit is the failure to pace. Recognizing that we're in this for the long haul, and that as leaders, there is a certain pace that is sustainable. And when we step out of that sustainable pace, it's going to oftentimes lead towards forms of exhaustion or burnout. So we've got pride or ego and impatience. The third one I would say is presumption. Presumption is this sense that I deserve more than I have. So presumption is the person who gets consistently offended when they're passed over for opportunities, when they carry their woundedness on their sleeves and suggest that people just don't value me the way that they should. They don't understand what I bring to the table, and why are other people always getting a chance before I do? Or they go get something, and this I think also moves back into impatience, but because they've convinced themselves that they deserve more than they have, they just go get it themselves. And we see this happen with ministry splits. We see this happen with people who go rogue, who fail to recognize the importance of operating within the context of a community of accountability. We don't need that. I don't desire that. I don't long for that. And so I just subvert that. And I see this happen a lot with young leaders who they don't want to be in a system, so they go create their own system only to find that their system can't sustain the vision that they have, and ultimately it leads them to a flash in the pan kind of ministry. Or I think presumption does something else to us. It makes us demand respect before we've actually done anything. I meet people that oftentimes they want to talk about why people should respect them, and when you really drill down, they haven't really done anything meaningful. I want to say to people, shut up, go do something, and then trust that your value will be recognized in the fruit of your ministry, not in how well you speak about what you're up to, but by what you were actually up to. This is, I'm going to confess something here. This sort of blogger experts who have never led in any significant way, who have never wandered through the journey of real trials and struggles through trying to lead groups and organizations, who can armchair quarterback all day and think that people should listen to them just because they think they've got something to say. And I'm always thinking to myself, what have you actually done that has informed the thoughts that you have and your expertise in what you're having to offer to others? Or that presumption shows up in terms of our concern for a bigger platform, right? And I think that's important as well. Is like, I want to make sure that I am recognized in some way as having a significant, influential platform. And again, this works out in a number of different ways in the way we market ourselves, the way we brand ourselves. So we've got ego, impatience, and presumption. And then I think another one would be comparisons and competitiveness. That I would put those two hand in hand. Comparisons measures ourselves against someone else's gifts or graces, their successes, what they're good at, what they've been able to accomplish. It really looks into someone else's lane, someone else's sweet spot, someone else's place that God has uniquely crafted them for, and measures your lane by someone else living in theirs. And I don't think we can measure ourselves in different lanes. And then competitiveness is the sense that my value is found in my ability to prove myself over and against someone else. So it's this loss of the sense of whose team we're actually on and who's on our team. I'm left thinking about specifically the disciples when they find people healing people in Jesus' name, right, or driving out demons, and they shut them down, right, because they're not of them. And I think it's too easy for that to happen. It's too easy for us to fail to be able to celebrate the victories and successes of someone else because we either feel like we've been shortchanged or cheated because we weren't the ones that were successful. We weren't the ones that people had turned to and looked to and said, look what they have done. So comparisons and competitiveness really sabotage our capacity to stand with other leaders and really celebrate the work of God in their leadership and in their ministry. And I think it really makes us petty and shallow, and I think we have to be attentive to that. So we've got ego, and we've got impatience, we've got presumption, and we've got comparisons and competition. So I want to pause here. I'm going to pause. We're going to come back to this lecture in another lecture, but I want to keep these videos somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes. So that's lecture 1, 4 of the 7 deadly sins. So we've got ego, impatience, presumption, comparison, and competition. And then we're going to come back and look at the last 3 in the next lecture.